On June the 16th in 1858, Abe Lincoln gave one of his most famous speeches. It became to be known as the House Divided speech. Probably one of the two most famous speeches he gave, along with the Gettysburg Address. And it was known as the House Divided speech because in that speech, Abe Lincoln actually paraphrased, almost quoted the words that Jesus spoke several different times in the gospel accounts. This idea that a house divided against itself cannot stand. Now, it's really interesting. Abe Lincoln actually lost that election. He was running for the Senate, got beat by a guy named Stephen Douglas, but he went on later to become the president. And as I say, everyone today knows about this famous speech that Abe Lincoln gave. Most of you are probably familiar with the events that occurred in Charlottesville, Virginia last week, which really, I think, demonstrate that what Abe Lincoln said and what Jesus said are still true today. That a house that's divided against itself cannot stand. Now, before I go any further, I want to make it absolutely 100% clear this morning that those who want to espouse racist views, these white supremacists and Nazis and people like that is 100% wrong, period. It's wrong. Those who would try to take the Scriptures and somehow justify some of those kind of ideas, that is straight from the devil himself. The Bible's so clear, isn't it? That God made every single one of us. God created every single person. And because of that, every single person has worth. And so when we try to disparage someone because of something like their race or where they were born or anything else like that, we are clearly violating what God says about the people that He created and the people that He loves. But as I think about some of the things that happened there that last weekend, it really does point out this whole idea that a house divided against itself cannot stand. Because what we find in this country is it seems like we've become so polarized, we've become so obsessed with wanting our own ways that now we can't even have civil conversations with each other. That things have devolved into these kind of confrontations that we saw last week. And fortunately, that is no longer an anomaly. It seems to be more and more common in our country, if you think about it. We see these things more and more and more. But I really believe, as I began to think about some of those things this week, that this is about more than just race. That there are some deeper root causes that are really adding to the divisions that we have in our country. And so this morning we're gonna look at the account of two kings who end up dividing the nation of Israel. And what we're going to find as we look at the account of those two kings is that they really had some of the same characteristics, I think, of what's going on in our country today. You know, I don't know about you. I'm pretty concerned about North Korea and about Iran and some of the things that are coming from without our country. But I tell you, I'm much more concerned about the things that are coming from within. Because we know from history that if you go back and look in history that most of the great civilizations throughout history, they haven't always been conquered from without. They've crumbled from within. And my fear is that if we don't address some of these root causes that we're going to look at this morning as a country, that's exactly what's going to happen to us. But we're also going to see this morning that there is some hope for us. What we find as we look at this story this morning, as we look in 1 Kings chapter 12, we're going to find that here's the root problem, I think. That division occurs when there's too much of me and not enough we. Now, you're not going to find that in your sermon outline this morning. Here's what happened. I have my sermon all finished on Thursday morning like I usually do. And then I got up on Friday morning and I spent some time with God, and God convinced me I needed to make some fairly major changes to the sermon this week. So you may not be able to follow along. You're not going to have a whole lot of the fill-in-the-blank kind of things like you usually do. So you may want to make some of your notes. And for those kids that have their clipboards this morning too, it's going to be a little harder. Usually there's some blanks you can fill in. Well, I've given you some other questions to consider this morning. And so you might even want to take a look at those now, parents and kids, so that you can kind of listen for those things as we go through the message this morning, because they won't be up on the screen where you can fill them in. But we're going to deal with this whole idea this morning that division occurs when there is too much me and not enough me. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and take them out this morning and turn to 1 Kings chapter 12. We left off last week in 1 Kings chapter 11, and there we stopped with Solomon, and we looked at this idea that Solomon really didn't finish very well. It was a sad story. And because of that, God had told Solomon, he says, Solomon, I'm going to take the kingdom away from you, but for the sake of your father David, I'm going to go ahead and leave a small part of that kingdom to you. And we're going to see that played out now as we get to 1 Kings chapter 12. And we're going to see that these two kings that play an integral part in that process here both suffer from what we've already seen. There was too much me and not enough we. So let me begin reading in 1 Kings chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. And as soon as Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard of it, for he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon, then Jeroboam returned from Egypt. And they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke on us, and we will serve you. He said to them, go away for 3 days, then come again to me. So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam took counsel with the old men who had stood before Solomon his father while he was yet alive, saying, how do you advise me to answer this people? And they said to him, if you will be a servant to this people today and serve them and speak good words to them, when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever. But he abandoned the counsel that the old men gave him and took counsel with the young men who had grown up with him and stood before him. And he said to them, what do you advise that we answer this people who have said to me, lighten the yoke that your father put on us? And the young men who had grown up with him said to him, thus you shall speak to this people who said to you, your father made our yoke heavy, but you lighten it for us. Thus shall you say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's thighs. And now, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the third day, as the king said, come to me again the third day. And the king answered the people harshly, and forsaking the counsel that the old men had given him, he spoke to them according to the counsel of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord spoke by Abijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Now, since Solomon, we know he had these, we saw last week, these 700 concubines, or 700 wives, 300 concubines. You would think that Solomon would have had a whole bunch of possible heirs coming behind him. He would have had all kinds of sons out of that. But you know what's really interesting? At least in the Bible, we only know of one. This guy named Rehoboam that we see right here in 1 Kings chapter 12. He's the only one. And we're also introduced in this chapter to the other king that's going to play an important part. The last part of the chapter is going to primarily focus on him, this guy named Jeroboam. Jeroboam was from Ephraim. And he lived in the northern part of the kingdom there. He had, under Solomon, he'd been in charge of forced labor there within the nation of Israel. So you can imagine that when Rehoboam comes to be the king over Israel, that he's not really happy with Jeroboam, and he threatens to kill Jeroboam. So Jeroboam takes off and he goes to Egypt and he stays there until King Solomon dies, and then he finally comes back. And we see this event that occurs right here in Shechem that's played out before us here. Shechem was a really important city in the scriptures. If you go back and look, we know that Abraham worshiped there. We know that Jacob built an altar there. We know that Joshua gathered all the people. That's where he gathered all the people, where they they reaffirmed this covenant that they had made with God. So it was a really important place. But the fact that Rehoboam had to leave his home in Jerusalem and go to Shechem meant that he was already coming from a position of weakness there. Now, this is probably a pretty good time for us to do a brief geography lesson, because we're going to be looking at several really important places today as we go through here. And I know this map is really probably hard for you to see. So I'm going to just point out, I'm going to try here to point out a couple of the important places that are here. Now, I couldn't find a really good map, so I had to use this one. It's a little off, but you'll notice right here where it says Jebus, that's actually Jerusalem. That's another name for Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, as you can see here, is in the southern part of, this is all of Israel here, all 12 tribes. And so there's Jerusalem right there. Shechem, just a little bit north of there. And you'll notice that Shechem is really kind of in the middle. It was a strategic city because it's right in the middle of the whole Commonwealth of Israel. Then finally, two other places we're going to look at. A place called Dan, which is way up here, almost at the very far north of the nation of Israel. And then down here, Bethel is the other place, which is just north of Benjamin there. We're going to come back to this map and look at a couple things later on, but that'll kind of give you a little bit of the lay of the land this morning. And as we look at this story this morning, what we find is that it's filled with a whole bunch of people who have way too much me and not enough we. So let's begin with the people themselves. It says that the people come to Rehoboam and they want to get some relief. And we find out here that Solomon, while he'd been really successful and the kingdom had really prospered under his leadership, that came at a cost. We know from this that those great building projects that had taken place, like the temple and like Solomon's palace, it had required a lot of forced labor. And so the people come to Rehoboam now, and they're asking for some relief. And there's really nothing wrong with that, but here's the problem. We know at the end of Solomon's reign that the people had turned away from God. And because of that, God's about to split this kingdom in two. So what did the people really need? What they really needed was to turn back to God and to worship Him and to follow Him and to serve Him. But all they were really caring about was what was in it for them. It was all about me and not a whole lot about we. And don't we see the same thing in our country nearly 3,000 years later today? We've made it all about me in this country, and what do we do as a people? We want to go to the government and we want to say, you provide for what I need. When what we really need is the same thing that they needed back then. We need as a country to turn back to God and to follow Him once again. And to serve Him and to seek Him. And yet we're so wrapped up. And just like we're going to see where Rehoboam and some of these kings, they oblige the wishes of the people. We've seen the same thing happen in our country today. So we see that the people are really more about what's in it for them than what's good for the whole. And I think that's exactly what happened last weekend in Charlottesville, Virginia. You had all these groups there, and every single group was all about what's in it for me. I want my rights. I want my rights. I want my rights. I want my rights. And there was no concern whatsoever for what's good for the whole. There was no concern about what does the other side think. What do they need? What are their wants? It was all about what's in it for me, and let's just forget everyone else. Let's not really care about what's good for the country as a whole. And so we've done exactly what they've done. Instead of humbling ourselves and turning back to God and seeking His face and asking Him to forgive and to heal our land, we've placed our faith in the government instead of God. So that was the people. How about Rehoboam? Let's take a look at Rehoboam. I mean, at first he seems to be pretty wise, doesn't he? The people come to him, they ask for some relief, and he says, hey, let me think about it for a little bit. Give me 3 days, and then come back, and I'll make my decision. Now, based on the evidence I see in the passage, I think Rehoboam already knew what he was going to do ahead of time. But he makes at least this pretense of going and getting some counsel from other people. So what does he do? The first thing he says, well, I'll go to these guys that served under my father Solomon, these elders. And they go to him. He says, they tell him, yeah, you should give some relief to these people, but that's not what he wanted to hear. So what does he do? He fires his whole cabinet, and he brings in a new cabinet. One that'll be a bunch of yes men and tell him exactly what he wants to hear. And so they advise him. They say, well, no, don't do that. You need to be even harsher. Go and tell him that even though your father Solomon disciplined them with whips, you're going to discipline them with scorpions. Now, the scorpions he's talking about here are not the ones we have in the desert here. They're these whips that have little metal pieces in them. But I'll guarantee you, if someone was hit with one of those, it would feel like they'd been stung by a scorpion. And so he says, no, I'm going to be even harsher than my father was. And I'm going to discipline you. And again, I think we see some of those same things going on in our country, like Rehoboam, who had forgotten that he was there to serve the people and to be a servant leader. We have political leaders who have forgotten that as well. And while they might not literally threaten us with whips and with scorpions, they have this idea of they're gonna be even more harsh with us. Kind of this idea like, let's kind of hold everyone down and let's get them in line sometimes to do what we want. Because really all they're about is preserving their own power. And so really they're not a whole lot different than what we see here with Rehoboam. And that is not limited, believe me, to any particular political party or political way of thinking or anything else. We see it. It's a broad problem that we have here in this country. So you can imagine God's probably not really happy with this, and it causes a lot of problems. So let's continue reading here in 1 Kings chapter 12, beginning in verse 16. And when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, what portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, David. So Israel went to their tents. But Rehoboam reigned over the people of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah. Then the king Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was taskmaster over the forced labor, and all Israel stoned him to death with stones. That's probably not the right guy he should have sent. And King Rehoboam hurried to mount his chariot to flee to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. And when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. There was none that followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only. When Rehoboam came to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen warriors, to fight against the house of Israel, to restore the kingdom to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God, say to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, king of Judah, and to all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, thus says the Lord, you shall not go up or fight against your relatives, the people of Israel. Every man return to his home, for this thing is from me. So they listened to the word of the Lord and went home again, according to the word of the Lord. So Rehoboam, he's forced to go back to Jerusalem for his own safety. And he gets back there and he assembles this army of 180,000 men because he says, I'm going to go fight and I'm going to take my kingdom back. And God comes to him, and at least, you got to give Rehoboam credit for this, at least one time in his life he finally listened to God. Hadn't sought God earlier, but he listens to him now. And so he chooses not to do that. But frankly, the fact that he doesn't go fight against his brothers right now, all it really does is postpone what's going to come for the next several centuries as these northern and southern kingdom continue to fight against each other. But at least for now, it's kind of postponed. This is probably, again, a good time to kind of define some terms, some ones that we've been using, some more that we're going to be using as we go through this study of the Old Testament. So once again, I've stuck this map up here, and I want to talk about a couple of terms that we use. The first one is the term Israel. Now, up to this point in the Scriptures, when the term Israel has been used, it usually refers to all 12 tribes here. I'm going to try to be really careful when I use the term Israel to make sure you know what I'm talking about. So a lot of times I'll use the term the Commonwealth of Israel. It's kind of the whole 12 tribes. That's the name God gave them. That's who they've been since the time of Jacob and up to this time. So up to this point in the Scriptures, most of the time, I won't say every time, but almost every time you see the word Israel, it's all 12 tribes. But when this split happens that we're looking at today, Israel is going to become only the northern 10 tribes. So basically all these here, Benjamin's a little tiny thing there, and up through here. So it becomes those 10 tribes there. And so from this point forward in the Scripture, Israel's going to refer to those northern 10 tribes. And so when you read about the king of Israel, it'll be the king, like in this case, the king Jeroboam, who reigns over those northern tribes. The other term we need to talk about is the term Judah. Now, Judah was one of the 12 sons of Jacob. There's a whole tribe named after him. But Judah, from the time the split happens, basically becomes these southern 2 tribes here. And I'm going to come back to Simeon in just a minute. But basically Benjamin and Judah. So that's those 2 tribes. Now, if you've been paying close attention, the last couple of weeks, and God comes to Solomon, and God says to Solomon, I'm going to give you how many tribes that your son will rule over? How many does he say? He says 1. If you've been looking carefully, he says 1. And yet now we see in this passage, there's actually 2, right? There's Judah and there's Benjamin. And then, and those of you who have been reading through Joshua this week, and I know Lauren noted this earlier in the week, how about Simeon? When Joshua gives the land to the tribe of Simeon, it's right in the middle of Judah. So what happens to Simeon? Why aren't they part of the southern kingdom? I don't know. I really don't for sure, but I think there's probably some pretty good ideas what happens. From the time that Joshua allots the land to Simeon, it wasn't a huge tribe, but I think what happens is over time they migrate to the north. And probably there's not a lot of the tribe of Simeon left at this point in time. And probably the same thing happens to Benjamin, because where's Benjamin? It's right on the border between the 2 kingdoms, right? And so there's probably some migration back and forth. And besides, both of those are so much smaller than Judah that Judah is the primary one. And here's what's really important, though, to remember, is that God preserves Judah because it's in the line of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. That's what's really important, is because the Messiah, Jesus, the line of Judah, he's going to come from the tribe of Judah. And so God preserves this kingdom for the sake of David and the promise that he made that he would have someone to reign over that kingdom forever. So things don't look too good here. The kingdom's now split in 2. I mean, it doesn't look real hopeful, but guess what? There's hope still. Here's the thing. Earlier in the week, if some of you read my Facebook post, I was kind of discouraged earlier in the week when I got in this chapter and started looking at it. But there's hope here. Because guess what? A little later on, some prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Hosea, they're going to all prophesy about a time in the future when guess what God's going to do? God's going to take Israel and God's going to take Judah and he's going to put them back together again. He's going to bring them into a land that he's prepared for them. So there's hope for Israel and there's hope for Judah. Now, I will tell you, I'm not aware anyway of any promise in the Bible that would apply like that to the United States. I don't think the United States is even mentioned anywhere in the Bible, which might be kind of instructive for us in some ways anyway. But I still think that we do have hope. Because as we're going to see in a verse that we're going to come back to in just a moment, that if we will humble ourselves and we will seek God's face and we will pray for our country, God has promised that he can restore even the divisions that are going on in our country right now. So there's some reason for us to have hope even in the midst of all this. Now, while all this is going on in Judah, Jeroboam is also trying to shore up his political base in the northern kingdom. So let me continue reading here in verse 25. Then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. And he went out from there and built Penuel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. If this people go up after this to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of the people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold, and he said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And he set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. Then this thing became a sin, for the people went as far as Dan to be before one. He also made temples on high places and appointed priests from among the people who were not of the Levites. And Jeroboam appointed a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the feast that was in Judah, and he offered sacrifices on the altar. So he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves that he made. And he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places that he had made. He went up to the altar that he had made in Bethel on the 15th day in the 8th month, in the month that he had devised from his own heart, and he instituted a feast for the people of Israel and went up to their altar to make offerings. So just like Rehoboam had done, Jeroboam, it's all about me and not enough about we. And all of that me stuff just adds to the division that's going on here. See, just because the northern kingdom had split off from the southern kingdom didn't mean that they didn't still have covenant obligations to God. And one of those covenant obligations was that 3 times a year, all the able-bodied men within Israel were supposed to travel to Jerusalem to the temple to worship God there. But Jeroboam's a little worried that if the people continue to do that, some of them might decide to stay down there in Jerusalem. And he might lose some of his political power. So what does he do? He devises a whole new religious system whose purpose is not to serve God, but to serve himself and to serve his power. He makes a new religion that's all about convenience. So instead of having to travel all the way down to Jerusalem, he now sets up these 2 golden calves, just as Aaron had done about 500 years earlier. Remember, Moses goes up on the mountain to get the law, and what does Aaron do? He builds these 2 golden calves, and where does he put them? He puts one, remember, Dan all the way in the north, and Bethel all the way in the south. And that's still pretty far, so he says, you know what I'll do? In addition to these 2 golden calves, I'm going to set up some high places all around the country, so it'll be really easy for people to go and to worship God. And he makes it really easy for them to do that. And then not only that, he takes some of the things that God had commanded in the scriptures, like the Feast of Tabernacles, which was supposed to occur on the 15th day of the 7th month, and he postpones it for a month to the 15th day of the 8th month. And not only that, the Levites now, they don't want to have anything to do with being priests of this new religion. And so he appoints priests who are not Levites, again, directly violating what God had told him to do. Not only that, he even took on some of the roles of the high priest himself. So he creates this whole religion out of convenience in order to prop him up and to make him popular politically. He even uses the same words that Aaron had used back there at the base of the mountain. Behold, Israel, here are your gods. I wonder how much of that goes on in our country too, because we're so focused on me and not on we. We see in our country that people are creating these whole religions, these whole religious experiences that are all about what's in it for me and what's convenient for me. How can I worship God in a way that's good for me, and how can I do it in a way that's really convenient? Even Christians, unfortunately, get caught up in this. We've talked before about churches who have tried to make Christianity palatable. So they don't want to talk about sin and hell and death and things like that, because that might offend somebody. And think about how convenient we've made it to go to church these days. You don't have to come to a building like this to go to church. You can get on the internet or on the radio or download a podcast, and you can listen to your favorite preacher. I'm a little upset if that's not me, but that's okay. I know you all have your favorites. That's fine. You can do that. You can even sit at home and go to church on the internet in your pajamas if you want. Now, believe me, I'm glad for the technology that allows those things to happen. I'm glad. I'm glad that our church and other churches who are doing good biblical teaching, that they're able to put it out there so Christians and those who are yet to become Christians, so they can listen to that, so they can grow in their relationship with God. I'm thankful that when we have people who can't get here to church because they're sick or disabled, that they can still join in with us. So I'm not saying there's anything wrong with any of those things. But at the same time, there's a lot of evidence in our culture that even those who are the most committed Christians are no longer quite as committed as they once were. It's no longer the norm for even the most committed Christians to be in church every Sunday. There was a church here in Phoenix a few years ago. They did a survey, and they surveyed all the young families in their congregation. They found that on average, that those young families came to church 1.6 times per month. And then they surveyed the entire congregation, and they found out of that entire congregation that only 20% of the entire congregation averaged coming to church 3 Sundays out of 4. And then, those that came 48 weeks out of the year or more, so they only missed 4 Sundays or less, that was down to 2% of the people in that church. Now, I just want to commend you guys because you're here, and most of you are here regularly, and I'm thankful for that. But what we're seeing in our country is that's no longer the case. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. There could be a lot, but here's the two that I think are the ones that are the biggest ones. The first one is that it's now so easy to make a religion that suits me by doing that. See, I can listen to my favorite preachers, and I can make sure I don't listen to the ones that talk about my sin, that don't talk about the need for repentance or for humbling myself before God or any of those other things that I don't like. I can listen to the ones that tell me if I pray to God and give Him money, I'll get rich. That sounds much better, doesn't it? So I think that's part of it. Because if you don't come here and gather with other people on a regular basis, you lose out on the accountability that's part of being a body like this. The second thing is that it's just become too inconvenient for people. There's other things that are more of a priority for them, to be real honest. I mean, think about it. You know, if you stay up really late on Saturday night and you don't really feel like getting up on Sunday morning, it's really easy to kind of blow off church. Or if your favorite football team happens to be playing, now I know I'm getting really personal, on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, you know it's real easy to stay at home and watch your favorite football team. I don't want to shame anyone here, but there was a couple who came last week. They were guests here. And I was talking to them after the service, and they said, I'm so sorry that we were late this morning. They said, all that rain we had last night, there was a wash that was flowing, and we had to drive all the way around that wash, and it took us over a half hour to get to church here this morning. Those were guests. And I wonder how many times that some of us allow something much less than that just keep us from being here because it's just not convenient. We've all heard that old adage that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. That's my fear for us as a nation, is that if we don't learn from what happened 3,000 years ago there in Israel, that we're doomed to repeat it as well. That same focus on me instead of we is going to, if it's not stopped, it's going to continue to tear our country apart. But I also have hope. I have hope because I know what God's going to do with Israel and Judah one day. He's going to bring them back together. I have hope, as Lauren pointed out earlier this week, when God was ready to rain down judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah, he says, if I could find at least even 10 righteous people in those cities, I won't do it. And certainly, while the numbers keep dwindling, there's way more than 10 righteous people who are committed to Jesus Christ here in this country. So I have hope. And I have hope also because of a verse that I'm going to share with you here in just a moment. So as we come here today, I want to make this really practical. I'm going to suggest 2 things that we can do. You know what? You and I by ourselves, we can't change this country, but we can do our part. And if we get enough people to do their part, we can begin to make some changes here in this country. So I'm going to suggest 2 things that you can do to heal some of these divisions. The first one is something you can do personally. The second thing is one that we're going to do together this morning. So here's the first thing that I can do, is I can give up my rights for the sake of the gospel. I can give up my rights for the sake of the gospel. That's ultimately the only thing that can bring healing and peace in our country is the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because Jesus himself came to this earth to take and to unite things that were separated. Here's what Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 2. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility. And that means that the gospel is more important than my rights. So if exercising my rights is going to be a stumbling block that keeps someone else from hearing and responding to the gospel of Jesus Christ, then I need to be willing to give those rights up. And this isn't the only place in the scriptures that talks about that. I'm just going to go through like 4 scriptures here, and I'm not even going to comment on them, but I think they speak to this issue. So they're all written by Paul. First one's in Philippians chapter 2. He writes this: do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Romans 14:9. So let us then pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbuilding. Mutual upbuilding. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Paul writes, I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessings. And finally, 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Therefore, if food makes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. I could come up with a whole lot more, but I think you get the idea. This week, there's been all kinds of debate in our country about whether I have the right to take down a Confederate monument, or about whether I have the right to have it remain there. You know what? I think if Paul was here today, he'd say, that's not really the issue. The issue is the gospel. Don't let anything like that get in the way of the gospel. One of my friends, a guy named Tom Terry, wrote this on Facebook this week, and I think this is so true. Here's what he wrote. He said, someday there will be no Confederate statues standing. Someday the Constitution and our great monuments will turn to dust. Someday all of the things that we fight for, no matter what political side we're on, will be long forgotten. In that day there will be one people, one Lord, and one kingdom. Isn't that the kingdom we should be looking for? So the first thing we have to do is I have to be willing to give up my rights for the sake of the gospel. The second thing we need to do is we need to pray for our country. We need to be praying for our country. We're commanded to do that in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And in just a moment, we're going to spend some time to do that together. I know I've gone a little long this morning, but this is important for us to do. And I think this is something we don't do particularly well, if we're really honest about it. We talk about praying for our country, but how well do we really do that? And here's 2 questions I want to suggest that you ask yourself when you think about praying for our country. First of all, do I pray for all the leaders, or do I only pray for the leaders that I agree with? Pretty easy to pray for the ones you like, the ones you support, isn't it? But how about praying for the ones that you completely disagree with? I have a list of people, government officials, that I pray for. And it's full of all kinds of people. And some of those people on that list, I will guarantee you, I disagree with everything that they stand for, everything that they would do as a politician. But you know what? I pray for them, not because I feel like it, but because the Scriptures have instructed me to do that. And I pray that God would give them wisdom. I pray that they would become followers of Jesus Christ. I pray that they would give up on this me stuff and be more about we and what's good for our country, and that they would serve our country. But I pray for all of them. And if you're only praying for the leaders that you like, then I don't think you're doing what the Bible tells you to do. It doesn't say, I can't find anywhere where it says pray for the leaders that you like. Here's the second question that I think you need to ask. Do I spend as much time praying for my country and its leaders as I do either propping them up or criticizing them? Do I spend more time praying for the leaders in this country than I do either supporting them or bashing them on Facebook every week? That'd probably be a pretty good test to start off right off the bat. Because if I'm not praying for, in this country we always say, well, if you don't vote for someone, you don't have the right to criticize them. I would say this, according to the Scriptures, if you don't pray for them, you don't have the right to criticize them either. So we need to pray for our country. And we're going to close this morning by doing just that. I want to take this second principle and I want to put it into practice. So in just a moment, I'm going to invite those of you who want to come up front to do it, fine. If you want to do it just right where you are, we're going to take a few minutes just to pray for our country this morning. And here's the verse that we're going to use as our guide as we do it, one that you're probably all familiar with. These are the words that God gave to Solomon after he dedicated the temple. God says to Solomon, Solomon, one day this people are going to turn away from me. But if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and heal their land. I think it's pretty clear what we need to pray this morning, isn't it? We need to humble ourselves and seek God's face. Pray for our country. So right now, I just want to invite you, if we want to all gather at the front to do that, I think that would be great. If you want to do it right where you're sitting, that's fine too. But we're just going to spend some time. I'm going to give you an opportunity to do that. Feel free to pray silently, pray out loud, however God might lead you. And then once we had a chance to do that for a few moments, I'll go ahead and close our time. So let's go ahead and let's put this into practice and let's pray for our country.